So I don't know if you pay much attention to the news. I'm somebody who does. I read the news pretty regularly. I don't know. I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing. At least I'm informed. I don't know if that's good or bad either. But one of the news stories that caught my attention on Wednesday, in particular, because of the topic that we'll be discussing this morning, was this headline of Kevin Costner. And Kevin Costner, you may recognize Kevin Costner as the Yellowstone actor, Dances with Wolves. There's several movies, Robin Hood, that he's famous for. But the headline was what you read there. His wife, Christine, has filed for divorce after 18 years of marriage. Now, if you read the news very often, this is something that you probably read fairly regularly. So-and-so actor or musician is going through a relationship breakup and a divorce. Divorce is culturally something that's pretty normal in our culture. Something quite common according to Psychology Today. The statistics on relationships loss are very sobering. So this is a quote from Why Relationships Fail. If not shocking, they say that to illustrate, one marriage dies every 36 seconds. The failure rate of first marriages is roughly 48%. And despite its rising popularity, cohabitation is not the answer. Sadly, unmarried couples who partner up fail at an even higher rate than those who actually marry. The article goes on to say that alarmingly, couples who marry for a second and third time split up at stratospheric levels, 60% for a second marriage. I've read up to 67%, and then 70% for those at a third time of marriage. And I read statistics even up to 83%. So divorce is I'm not telling you anything that you don't know, right? I mean, this is we all have been affected by divorce. We perhaps we're here this morning and we've been divorced. We have family members who've been divorced. There's neighbors, coworkers. There's not any one of us who have not been impacted, watched, journeyed alongside a family member or friend through the pain of divorce. And what we're talking about this morning is a very hard topic. It's not easy to talk about this for a lot of reasons, but certainly it is a hard topic to talk about. And it fits in the conversation that we've been having over the past 2 months now in the hard sayings of Jesus. Jesus said a really hard thing about marriage, remarriage, and divorce. And before we look at that, it's just a reminder that we're in this series, Hard Sayings of Jesus. We're reading through the book of Mark during the week. And if you've been reading, you're probably on your third time through the book. And we're just kind of digging into the book of Mark, but then on Sundays, talking about the hard things that Jesus says. We're digging into them. We're trying to understand what is it that Jesus means when he says these hard things. And so today's hard saying comes from Mark chapter 10. It's the passage that's immediately following what we looked at last week when Jesus said, if your hand causes you to sin, or your foot causes you to sin, or your eye causes you to sin, cut it off. The very next text is Mark chapter 10. And Jesus, in this text, says a very hard thing. In verse 11, he says, anyone who divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband and marries another man, she commits adultery against him. This is a hard saying. It is hard for lots of reasons. And as I've reflected on why it's so hard, I wrote down 6 things. The first one is this. This statement that Jesus makes seems like an impossible standard. Kaden, can you go to the next slide? It seems like an impossible standard. Like, the reality is that life is hard and marriage is hard, and to be able to live up to that standard of absolutely no divorce and no remarriage if I do divorce seems like impossible. Secondly, it feels judgmental and condemning. I mean, if I find myself living in a difficult relationship and the action is to end that relationship, it feels like, to listen to these words, that it's condemning of me. I'm being judged by Jesus. Others may feel this sense of lack of empathy or a lack of compassion on the part of Jesus. Like, come on, Jesus, what is your understanding? Don't you understand how hard this relationship is that I'm in? And for you to just say, to stay in marriage, don't you understand how hard it is for me? And this hurts. And so it feels as though Jesus lacks any kind of compassion for somebody stuck in such a hard relationship. And then 4, I think about some situations, and doesn't it seem like this would be a foolish thing for some people? It'd be foolish to remain in a marriage that's destructive, that's physically harmful to a person, that maybe is emotionally harmful. It's like, maybe you walk with somebody through these times, and it's like, it seems foolish. And then maybe some might feel like this seems so narrow, so restricting. Jesus, what about this situation? And what about that situation? And what about the complexity of this situation? Where's any allowance for any? It just seems so narrow when life is, and any one relationship is so complex. And then finally, it seems incredibly personal. Right? Maybe you are divorced, or maybe you are walking through a very difficult marriage and it is on the way to divorce, or maybe you've walked with somebody through these waters. And so just reading these words that Jesus says is hard and it hurts. And so for all of these reasons, this is a challenging, this is a very hard saying. And you may list other reasons for why this is hard. But just because it's a hard saying doesn't mean it's not something that we should just skip past. No, in fact, we need to dig into it. We need to think deeply about what Jesus is saying. We need to look at this context of what it is that he is saying and begin to understand it. Because Jesus, we've come to know Jesus to be good. We've come to know that his teachings are good. So maybe there's something that we need to learn more about in regards to that big, long list of why this is so hard. So if you have a Bible, I invite you to turn to Mark 10, and we're going to read verse 1 through verse 12. Then Jesus left that place, and that place, we said last week, was likely someplace in Capernaum. Then Jesus left that place, and he went into the region of Judea and across the Jordan, which is the river. Again, crowds of people came to him, and as was his custom, he taught them. Now some Pharisees came, and they tested Jesus by asking, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife?" Characteristic Jesus, he responds not by answering their question, but with a question. What did Moses command you? He replied. And they said, well, Moses permitted a man to write a certificate of divorce and to send her away. And Jesus' response was this: it was because your hearts were hard that Moses wrote you this law. But at the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. And for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no man separate. Now, when they were in the house again, the disciples asked Jesus about this. And he answered, anyone who divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband and marries another man, she commits adultery. So this is the text and the context, and there's lots here. Matter of fact, there's so much here that it's impossible to, in the next 25 minutes, unpack it all. In fact, this is so complex that it requires dozens and dozens of hours of study and research and reflection and interaction and consideration. I don't know, I probably have 40 to 60 hours, not in the past week, but 40 to 60 hours wrestling with this text and this issue of divorce and remarriage. So I'm not going to be able to say everything. There's just no way. Another thought, there are way more passages than just this passage that address the topic of marriage, divorce, and remarriage. And to look only at this text, apart from all of the other texts, would be a mistake. Well, the Bible is 66 books, and we're looking at one of those books, Mark. The Bible is one book, right? The Bible is God's authoritative word, and what is said in one place must be understood in the context of what is said in other places. So it's never safe to just look at one passage and come to conclusions based on just one thing that is said in one place. Because you'll be reading it and reflecting on it and coming to conclusions without understanding the whole of what God says on the topic. And so, for example, we can't read this and come to super solid conclusions apart from reflecting on Matthew chapter 5, 31 through 32, or what Jesus says in Matthew 19, verses 3 to 12, or what the prophet Malachi says, or what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 7, or what Moses says in Deuteronomy 24 and Leviticus and several texts in Deuteronomy. All of this needs to put together in that context. And so, again, I'm not going to be able to get into all of this. We can't, in one message, dig into all of that. And then the third comment that I'll offer before we jump into this, I certainly am going to come to some conclusions, and some of you are going to be disappointed by that. Some of you are going to just disagree with where I end up on the topic. Why? Well, because you have a different opinion. You have a different understanding. There's a fantastic resource. It's a book that was written some 30 years ago. And the title of it, and Caden, can you go to the next slide? Here we go. The title of it is Divorce and Remarriage. And it is a book written, edited, and put together, but there are 4 different authors from 4 conservative evangelical seminaries, and they represent 4 different positions on this topic. And so you see that the 4 positions are no divorce and no remarriage ever, period. The second one is no divorce, or divorce is acceptable under some circumstances, but no remarriage. The third, divorce under some circumstances, remarriage under some circumstances. And then the last one is divorce and remarriage under a number of different circumstances. So whatever position I land at, and these are the 4 basically, the 4 basic positions that you're going to find discussed and argued. And you, if you've wrestled with this, probably know where you land. You're in one of those categories. But guess what? There's probably somebody sitting next to you or across the room who shares a different opinion. And so where I conclude may be different than where you conclude. And so I'm going to attempt to unpack my thoughts in a humble way, without saying this is the way that you must understand this. And I ask that you would afford me the same kind of respect back, and that we have this conversation, this discussion in grace. After all, we are an evangelical free church, right? And one of the big sayings of the Evangelical Free Church of America is that in unity in essential issues and charity in non-essentials. And so we would say there are 10 key doctrinal things that we will battle and go to war over. But after that, there's a bunch of other issues that are not, they don't rise to that level of doctrinal that require us to separate and divide over. And this would be one of those. So with all of that as background, now let's jump into verse 1 and get into what it is that Jesus says. So in verse 1, Jesus left that place, right? And again, that place is Capernaum, based on the context from chapter 9. And what's said next is helpful and important. He leaves that place and he goes to the region of Judea and across the Jordan. So I have a map for us. You'll see here on the next slide. You see that Capernaum is up north, and I know that some of the words are kind of small here. It might be a little difficult to see. But 12 o'clock is Capernaum. Capernaum is located, and this is where we've been, and several of the hard sayings. Jesus was in Capernaum, right? It's the northern portion, the northern side of the Sea of Galilee. The text tells us that Jesus leaves there and he goes south to Judea. So you see, Judea is the brown area, orangey brown area. And the Jordan is that fine, thin blue line that goes from the Sea of Galilee to the Dead Sea, straight, from 12 to 6 o'clock. And the text tells us that Jesus leaves Capernaum, he goes down to Judea, and he crosses the Jordan. So you see Bethany east of the Jordan there around 3 o'clock. Well, I guess that's probably like 4 o'clock. And below the heading of Perea. That's important. And we'll come to that in just a second. The other thing that we see in this text is that Jesus is teaching, right? He's teaching the crowds. And so just kind of 2 quick observations. The first observation is this, that the geographical content that Mark gives to us gives a sense of historicity. These are real places. Archaeologically, we have looked at this several times. There are foundations of homes and synagogues, and these are real places. Real people just like us lived there. The amount of detail that Mark gives continuously leads itself to believability that what we're reading actually happened. This isn't a story. This isn't somebody who sat down and wrote things down. That this is historical. There's really a person named Jesus. He really lived in a real place on this planet called Israel. He really interacted with people and he taught them. Other places, as we read in the Gospels, his teaching is with authority. People gathered around. His teaching was transformative. It was enlightening. It was challenging. It was hard sometimes and confusing. And then the text tells us that Pharisees came and they tested him. Now, this testing isn't a true inquiry. They weren't really looking for an answer to the question that they were about to pose. And instead, they were hoping to catch Jesus in some kind of controversy. And this is where Perea comes in. You see, Perea is the home of Herod. Herod, King Herod, recognize the name, right? King Herod, who put John the Baptist to death. He had beheaded John the Baptist not too long prior to this, several years prior to this event. Why was John the Baptist put to death? Well, John the Baptist was put to death because Herod married his brother's wife, Herodias. His brother and his wife came to town one day, and she found Herod interesting. And so she divorced her husband and married Herod. And John the Baptist confronted him on it and said, what you're doing is wrong. Herod is a Jew. He should know the law. He was not following the law. Well, Herod and Herodias didn't really like this, and so they beheaded John the Baptist. So Mark giving us this detail, and the Pharisees asking the question that they're asking in Perea, in Herod's hometown, is significant. Why are the Pharisees asking this question there? Likely because they're trying to trip up Jesus. They're trying to get Jesus to say something that's going to be offensive to Herod, and thus they could get rid of Jesus in the same way that John the Baptist was gotten rid of. And so they come to Jesus and they test him. And they ask him this question: is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? Now, why that question? Well, that question because Herod had married a divorced woman. And what's interesting is that the people who are asking this question, the Pharisees, the teachers of the law, they had a debate amongst themselves. And they went at it. They had different opinions. When is it okay to divorce? And when is it right to remarry? And so this was an issue that they were debating amongst themselves, and therefore we're interested to hear what Jesus might say to them about the issue. Jesus' response, though, is not to answer their question. He's a master. He's a master. He doesn't fall for their trap. And instead, he asks them a question, right? He asks them, what did Moses command you? And they said, it's very interesting what they said. They said, Moses permitted a man to write a certificate of divorce and to send her away. Now, what are they quoting? Well, they're quoting the law. But what they're not doing in quoting the law is they're not quoting the whole law. They're only giving a very small part of the law. And very wisely on their part, or sneakily on their part, not getting into what it is that they wanted Jesus to get into, and that is the debate. So their reply is like it's way up here. It's wimpy. It's a wimpy answer. And so you're wondering maybe, well, where's this law? What is the law that they're referring to? Well, that law is in Deuteronomy chapter 24. So if you have a Bible and you want to flip there, you could go. You go to Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 1, and this is what they were answering to Jesus. They said, they understood that Moses had said this: if a man marries a woman who becomes displeasing to him because he finds something indecent about her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and gives it to her and sends her to her house, or sends her from his house. See, this is the law that they're referring to. And they only refer to a part of it, right? They refer to the part that Moses permits us to write a certificate of divorce. But what they leave out is the part that they're debating. The part that they're debating is what has become displeasing to him, and what is this something indecent? This become displeasing to him is, in the Hebrew, is 4 words. And I've given us the translation of those 4 words together in this sentence. It means to falls out of. The second word is finding. The third word is favor or charm. And then in eyes. It's in his eyes. So it's to fall out of finding favor or charm in his eyes. We might say he fell out of love with her. So if a man marries a woman who falls out of love with her because he finds something indecent about her, well, what's this indecent? This indecent, well, that word can mean bare, it can mean naked, it can mean completely exposed, it can mean shameful, it can mean indecent. And that's the debate. You see, it's not clear. It's not absolutely clear what this means. And so when Moses says if a man marries a woman who becomes displeasing to him, but because he finds something indecent about her and writes her a certificate of divorce, the question is, well, what did Moses mean when they're finding something indecent? What is this indecent issue? And this is where the Pharisees disagreed. So there's 2 views. The house of Shammai, or the school of Shammai, interpreted the statement as some kind of sexual misconduct. In some way, the wife wasn't faithful to her husband. But the house of Hillel interpreted the phrase as anything unseemly. And you see here, I give a much fuller explanation. The phrase can be something unseemly, argue that a man is licensed to divorce his wife for any unseemly thing, including, and here we go, the house of Hillel says that a man may divorce his wife even if she has merely ruined his dinner. And Rabbi Akiba says he may divorce her even if he finds another woman more beautiful than she is, as it says, if she finds no favor in his eyes. And those are quotations of where this occurs in rabbi writings. And so this is the discussion, right? So the Pharisees, the teachers, have this discussion. They have this debate amongst themselves. And they ask Jesus, what's your answer to this? But they never bring any of this up. They leave all of that in the background, right? They just simply say, well, Moses permitted a man to write a certificate of divorce and to send his wife away. So they're wimps. They wimp out. And Jesus, being this master teacher, though, and knowing all of this, rather than entering into the debate and answering the question and trying to say, this is what you should do, instead, he just asks them a question. And the question is pretty significant. It gets him to talk, right? And then it leads him to his response. After they say Moses permitted a man to write a certificate of divorce, Jesus then said this: it was because your hearts were hard that Moses wrote you this law. And then Jesus said, at the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one. Therefore, what God has joined together, let not man separate. And what Jesus does is he takes them back to the beginning, to the way that God designed man and woman. And it was God's intent for a man and a woman to be united, husband, wife, two become one forever. He takes them back to that. He reminds them of that, right? And what he does by laying that against Moses' law, which go to the next slide, please. Here we see see it laid against Moses' law, right? Next slide. God's design in marriage is to take two and to make them one, making it impossible to undo what he has done. This is what Jesus is teaching when he says that a man will leave his father and mother, and the two will be united as one. He wants them to understand this is God's design. So we see this pictured in a marriage ceremony, right? For those of you who got married 30 or 40 years ago, 50 years ago, the picture typically was that of a candle, right? It was a unity candle. So the ceremony would begin perhaps by the mother coming down with a candle or lighting a candle for the bride, lighting a candle for the groom, right? And then there's a place in the ceremony in which the two candles are picked up, right? Representing two independent lives, the bride and the groom, and then lighting a unity candle, blowing out the two, and then you have one, right? If you've been married in probably the past 10 or so years, or maybe the past 15 years, the symbol in marriage ceremonies has changed, getting away from that, and many times it's a colored sand. So it might be a red sand and a green sand or a blue sand or whatever. And each colored sand represents, and they pour it together. And when you watch the marriage ceremony and the bride and the groom pouring together the red and the green sand, the red, which was distinct in the one vase, and the green, which was distinct now, is all blended together. Thus picturing this idea of the two becoming one. Another popular way of picturing that today is the weaving together of three strands of rope. The one strand representing God, the other two strands, the bride and the groom, and they weave them together and they become one. This is the picture. This is what Jesus is saying. You guys are talking about divorce. You're talking about when it's okay to divorce and to remarry. You guys got it all wrong. You see, you can't undo what God has done. God put two together. He's made them one. You can't take that apart. You need to understand this is God's vision. This is his design. This is his intent. In fact, you're asking the wrong question. You're looking at this the wrong way. And in fact, what Jesus knew was that they wanted to get divorced so that they could get remarried. Really, the issue should have been, the better question should have been this. What do we do when we find ourselves as a husband and wife in a marriage that's dissatisfying to us? How do we reconcile that? How do we move closer together? How do we go back to what it was that we were experiencing when we went down the aisle and we said, I do? That's the better question, Pharisees. The better question is for you, dissatisfied husband, to reflect on Ephesians chapter 5 and to go back there and to spend time there understanding that what God has said to you is that it is your responsibility as the husband to love your wife the way that Christ loves the church, to in fact die to yourself, even though you're in a relationship with a woman that is dissatisfying and displeasing to you and the relationship isn't good. And for you wives who are in relationships with your husbands that are dissatisfying, you're frustrated, you want out, and you're thinking about divorce, the application is no. Jesus is saying no. Go back and look at what it is that is my intention. Wives, you're to submit to your husbands, meaning willfully place yourself under. Wives, what does it look like for you to love your husband, the difficult, pain in the neck, unloving man that he is? You see, what Jesus is saying is men and women who are married, what you need to do is you need to go back and remember what it is that you are designed for, and that is to be one, which in fact is what you are. You are one because you're married. You're having the wrong conversation. Now, that's helpful It is helpful, isn't it? It is good for us to be reminded of that, husbands, right? That even though you may be dissatisfied in your relationship, that it's your responsibility to become the man. It's your responsibility to step up. It's your responsibility to grow and change. It's your responsibility to confess your sin. It's your responsibility to live rightly before God and to love your wife the way that Christ loves the church. And why? For you to do the same. And if that's our attitudes, if that's both spouses' attitudes, well, then maybe we can come to reconciliation. And this is what Jesus' heart is all about. This is why he takes them back to this. And then the conversation's over. What's interesting is Mark records that the Pharisees say nothing. But then next, Jesus goes into the house. And this is the hard part, right? Jesus goes into a house, and he's there with his disciples, and they ask him further questions, and his answer is, anyone who divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband and marries another man, she commits adultery. Couple observations. First of all, this is shocking to the Jewish ears. Why? Because the Jewish law gave women no right at all. Gave them no way out. A woman could never divorce her husband. Jesus, in his response, actually elevates the status of women. So this is very shocking. The other thing that's shocking is that a man under Jewish law could never commit adultery against his wife. And yet, here Jesus is saying, you can and you do if you do this. Another observation is that the two phrases are tied together. Jesus' statement is that if anyone divorces and marries, commits adultery. Jesus doesn't talk about just divorce. He's not commenting on divorce. He's commenting on divorcing and remarrying. You can't separate the two statements. They go together. And with the ambiguity to Jesus' response earlier, with him not addressing what Moses said earlier, there's a sense in which, this is very fascinating, Jesus doesn't untangle the questions that people have. When is divorce appropriate? When is it inappropriate? He just seems to leave it hanging there. And so it would be helpful at this point to go back and actually read the rest of what the law says. So if you go back and you read all of Deuteronomy 24, this is what Deuteronomy 24, 1 through 4, the whole context says, if a man marries a woman who becomes displeasing to him because he finds something indecent about her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and gives it to her and sends her from his house, and if after she leaves his house, she becomes the wife of another man. Okay, so we just see divorce, and now we're seeing remarriage. And her second husband dislikes her and writes her a certificate of divorce. And so again, in the law, we are seeing divorce. And gives it to her and sends her from his house. Or if he dies, then, this is the teaching, then under this circumstance, this is the teaching. Her first husband who divorced her is not allowed to marry her again. That's the teaching of the law. It's not about whether you're divorced or whether about you remarry. It's about if you're divorced and remarry, and then after remarrying somebody else and then divorcing them and going back to marrying the first person that you were married to. That's what this law is about. And so when you look at this, and this is important too to remember, that this isn't Moses' law. This is God's law. Okay, so when we read these words, and it's also important to remember that Jesus is God. So when Jesus, together with the Father and the Spirit, give this instruction to Moses, to the nation of Israel, while they're wandering in the wilderness and giving them guidance about how they're to behave as a society, it's clear that divorce was permitted. So there you go. I just gave you my interpretation, right? I'll go back all the way to where I began. Some of you will say, no divorce, no marriage ever. I think, just based on Deuteronomy 24, I don't know how I could ever conclude that. God permitted divorce, and he permitted remarriage. Now, some will argue that Jesus comes along and he elevates the law. I don't know how you can. I don't know how you can do that. Jesus changed his mind. Why didn't he give the elevated law in Deuteronomy 24? But that's what the position of no divorce and no remarriage argues, is that Jesus has elevated the law. I just can't. I don't see that. He permitted it. He permitted it. He permitted it. God permits divorce. God permits remarriage in Deuteronomy 24. That leads me to make these two final concluding points. It's because of sin that divorce is a fact of societal life, right? And so when a couple comes to the place of saying our marriage is over, we're divorcing, it's because there is sin in the relationship, right? Sometime ago, there was something that happened. He said something, she did something. And when that happened, he didn't forgive or she didn't forgive. And so there's tension. There's not the reconciliation of the relationship. So there's distance. And then more time goes by, and there's more sin, and there's more sin, and there's more sin, and sin doesn't get confessed. Sin doesn't get forgiven. Reconciliation doesn't occur in the relationship. And so eventually, the two get to the place in which it doesn't work anymore. Now, it could be that one party in the relationship is more the offending party. It could be that one party in the relationship is confessing and seeking forgiveness and extending reconciliation, but the other party just keeps on shoving away. And thus, divorce ends up becoming the legal ending of the relationship that has ended already. Now, this is never God's ideal, but this happens. We are broken people, and sometimes we get into broken relationships, and people in that relationship continue to live broken lives, sinful lives. So because of sin, divorce is a fact of societal life. But secondly, well, God does not approve of divorce, right? This is not his idea. Jesus took us to the beginning. While God does not approve of divorce, he disapproves of its alternative, staying married sometimes. Sometimes he disapproves of its alternative more than he disapproves of divorce itself. Now, I'm giving you my position. This is my position. If you come to me and you say, Pastor Kirk, this is my situation, I will say, are you living like a wife? Like you should be. If you're a husband, I will say, are you living like the husband that you should be? And you need to be working at that. And you need to keep working at that. And if I'm walking with you through this, it may be that over time we come to a conclusion that he is so living opposed to you that it's best for you to get out of that relationship. Or she's living so opposed to you, it is best. And those are individual, those are hard and complex and should never be pursued lightly. Never. Why? Because it's hard to undo what God has done when he's made two one. You're ripping at things, we're tearing at things, we're breaking the design that God has intended in marriage. I'm going to ask our worship team to come on up. As they're coming, I'm just going to read this statement. It's a Facebook post. I read this a year and a half ago in a message. And as I was working on this, I just got to read this again. This comes from a young 20-something woman living in our community. She's friends of my daughter, went to school. My daughter shared classes with her. And one day, she posted this Facebook post. This is what she wrote. She wrote, "Fight for your marriage. I've seen people get divorced around me before, and it seems as simple as a name and a relationship change online. No. Divorce is days where all you want is to hug your mother-in-law and you can't. Watching your dogs, kids, family, really anyone on your side miss that person desperately and not always understand why they aren't there. It's not knowing what to do with the album of favorite photos of them that you've had forever on your phone, changing their contact to their name. Divorce is moments of routine where you see your person's favorite food in the store and grab it out of instinct and then have to put it back in tears because you realize you don't need it. It's losing the most intimate connection I think you can know in life and not being able to do anything about the deep loneliness that comes from it. Divorce is wearing your husband's PJ pants for the last time and returning his clothing that you've had for almost a decade. It's packing up all your photos that were displayed around your house. It's sleeping alone for the first time. Divorce is thinking back on everything that went wrong and having to learn daily to forgive yourself. Learning to be at peace with the loss of a best friend, a love, a connection, and watching that person become a stranger again. So fight for your marriages. Work on it together, not apart, because the last day you get to do their laundry, that last kiss, the day you move out of your home, it's going to hurt deeper than you could ever imagine. Jesus, help us. Help us to become men and women who are becoming more and more like you. As we live in difficult relationships, pray especially for those who are walking through really, really hard relationships. Pray that you would encourage and strengthen them, give them clarity, help them. Use your church to come alongside, to help and to encourage and to support. This is such a hard saying, Jesus. I thank you for saying it. I thank you for caring enough about us as people to call us to the ideal. Help us to live up to it. It's in your name we pray. Amen.
Would you please stand and worship with us? I'm calling on the God of Jacob, whose love endures through generations. You will keep your covenant. I'm calling on the God of Moses, the one who opened up the ocean. I need you now to do the same. My God, I need you. Oh God, my God, I need you now. How I need you now. Oh rock of ages, I'm standing on your faithfulness. Oh, your faithfulness. I know all things are possible. I'm calling on the God of David, who made a shepherd boy courageous. I may not face Goliath, but I've got my own giant. Oh God, my God, I need you. Oh God, my God, I need you now. How I need you now. Oh rock of ages, I'm standing on your faithfulness. Oh, your faithfulness. You hurt your children, and you hear your children now. You are the same God. You are the same God. You answered prayers back then, and you will answer now. You are the same God. You are the same God. You were providing. You are providing. You are the same God. You are the same God. You moved in power then. God moved in power now. You are the same God. You are the same God. You were a healer then. You are a healer now. You are the same God. You are the same God. You were a savior then. You are a savior now. You are the same God. You are the same God. You freed the captives then. You're freeing hearts right now. You are the same God. You are the same God. You touch the leper's neck. I feel your touch right now. You are the same God. You are the same God. Oh God, my God, I need you. Oh God, my God, I need you now. How I need you now. Oh rock of ages, I'm standing on your faithfulness. Oh, your faithfulness. I'm calling on the Holy Spirit. Almighty river, come fill. Oh, come and fill me.
May that happen today in us. May we be renewed and energized as husbands, as wives, by the Spirit of God. Maybe renewing our commitment to our relationship with our spouse. For those of us who are struggling, may today be a time in which God encourages and strengthens you. Go Hope Community Church. Have a good week. If you want to talk, I'd be glad to do that.